Hello, my name is Haley, and my project is on epigenetics and racial trauma. I was inspired to research this topic because I read a book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. It is a book that generally discusses like the psychology of racial power structures in America and various like psychotherapeutic concepts and protocols and how they intersect with race. Um, he briefly, I would say relatively briefly, like talks about epigenetics in it, and he makes some pretty bold claims and talks about some research studies and it kind of interprets them a little bit in his book. And I just wanted to see like what wider research and conversations regarding the topics he was referencing looked like so I could understand what he was saying and evaluate what he was saying within a larger context. So here's one of the quotes that inspired me. The transference of trauma isn't just about how human beings treat each other. Trauma can also be inherited genetically. Recent work in genetics has revealed that trauma can change the expression of DNA in our cells, and these changes can be passed from parent to child. So a research study that he connects to this quote is described as follows. This research has led to the creation of a new field of scientific inquiry known as epigenetics, the study of inheritable changes in gene expression. I would be careful about saying inheritable changes in gene expression, because one thing I've learned from doing this project is one that epigenetics is like much more broader than the study of inheritable changes. That's more of like a subset section of epigenetics. Um, that is at this point kind of new and frankly like speculative. Epigenetics has transformed the way scientists think about genomes. The first study to clearly show that stress can cause inheritable gene defects in humans was published in 2015 by Rachel Yehuda and her colleagues titled Holocaust Exposure-Induced Intergenerational Effects in FKBP5 Methylation. Earlier studies identified the same effect in animals. Yehuda's study demonstrated that damaged genes in the bodies of Jewish Holocaust survivors, the result of the trauma they suffered under Nazism, were passed on to their children. Later research confirms Yehuda's conclusions. Um, Basically, like a few critiques I have here of this quote after researching is just how vague he is with earlier studies identified the same effect in animals, and he just doesn't link to a study there. Also, he says later research confirms Yehuda's conclusions but does not link to anything. I just feel like that's not super scientific, especially when you're making bold claims like this. Um, but I do think that it's an interesting topic, and I do think this is a interesting study. Um, I just would be careful about being like the first study to being like the first study to clearly show that stress can cause inheritable gene defects in humans because the study is more of an interesting speculative like inspiration point than like a clear positive confirmation of these ideas. Another quote from the book that I thought was interesting was, and it gets weirder. We now have evidence that memories connected to painful events also get passed down from parent to child and to that child's child. What's more, these experiences appear to be held, passed on, and inherited in the body, not just in the thinking brain. So the study he connects to this is a landmark study demonstrating this effect in mice was published in 2014 by Carrie Ressler and Brian Diaz called Parental Olfactory Experience Influences Behavior and Neural Structure in Subsequent Generations. Ressler and Diaz put male mice in a small chamber then occasionally exposed them to the scent of acetylene, which smells like cherries, and simultaneously to small electric shocks. Eventually, the mice associated the scent with pain. They would shudder when they were exposed to the smell, even after the shocks were discontinued. The children of those mice were born with a fear of the smell of acetylene, so were their grandchildren. As of this writing, no one has completed a similar study on humans, both for ethical reasons and because we take a lot longer than mice to produce a new generation. I do think this is like an interesting study, and it does like open up kind of the field of intergenerational like epigenetic trans um m mission like being like a possibility. Um, I don't like that he hid the fact that the study was like a study in ma in mice, like in the footnotes and just kind of in the main part of the book, just made kind of implied that this was like proven in humans. Um, but yeah. One more quote where he's kind of talking about these concepts in the book that's not really connected to a study. Um, that I thought just kind of reflected how we generally conceptualize this type of stuff, though, was this trauma, as well as a variety of self-protective strategies that got built around it, has been passed down and compounded over many generations. They were likely passed down epigenetically as expressions of people's DNA. They were also passed down as habits, actions, sensations, urges, images, narratives, beliefs, and ideas. Over generations, the original context was forgotten and the trauma became cultural traits or norms. I just he I'm not a huge fan of how he just confidently said like we're likely passed down epigenetically as expressions of people's DNA because I just don't think that we're there yet in terms of evidence backing these ideas, even though they are interesting and worth investigating. I do agree with some of what he's saying though, like the idea that trauma is passed down as habits, actions, narratives, beliefs, ideas, like the idea that trauma is connected to like behavioral conditioning is more scientifically backed, and the idea that it's passed down by like parental modeling, like um broader like cultural scripts, power structures in society, things like that are more proven methods of transmitting trauma. The idea that it's transmitted genetically is just not super backed at this point, from what I understand. Okay, now I'm going to talk about what are epigenetics. Epigenetics are changes in gene expression that do not alter the underlying DNA sequence. The most commonly studied form of epigenetic modification is DNA methylation. An individual's epigenetic pattern changes throughout their life. This is the understood mechanism behind epigenetic trauma. So basically, how I think of epigenetics very broadly is this is your genetic structure, your DNA, and epigenetics are like biological mechanisms that interpret the expression of the DNA, and that can change throughout an individual's lifetime. That's generally like thought like that's generally scientifically backed, that the idea that the expression can change throughout a different life, and like the epigenetic markers of an individual can change in one person's life. The idea of transmission down to the next generation is a lot more controversial because it's generally understood that most methylation and just epigenetic markers and stuff are erased during reproduction. So it's just generally understood that those don't go down to the next generation because they aren't really part of DNA. Um, there is some early stage evidence pointing to parental methylation markers reaching or influencing sperm like slash egg cells, leading to development, physiology or behavior impacts in offspring of rats. That's basically referencing, I think, like the study we talked about earlier from the book. This is a proposed mechanism of epigenetic trauma. It is a newer field and the mechanism is not understood yet. What evidence do we have that what evidence do we have that experiences affect epigenetics? So now I'm going to talk about the studies that have been done in this field. So here is one study. This is an early study to just set the stage. It's done in 2004. So that's when like these ideas kind of began, around when these ideas started coming into the literature, and this study is pretty simple. Like it basically found that there was methylation differences connected to a gene that regulated stress in a population of rats that had nurturing mothers versus less nurturing mothers. So a stress difference in a developmental stage caused differences in methylation patterns in rats. So this is like interesting because what if this is true in humans too? Um, and next we have a study, and that basically does connect these same ideas to human beings. And it's a study using a data set from the Dutch famine in World War II. It basically found differences in methylation patterns in people exposed to a famine and their siblings who were not exposed to the famine in a gene connected to growth. So this was important because it connected the idea of epigenetic um, changes in individuals' life connected to trauma. Here's the study that is mentioned in my grandmother's hands. I'll read it again if you don't remember. Researchers conditioned male mice to fear a cherry blossom-like odor by pairing it with mild shocks. Surprisingly, both their offspring and grand offspring were more sensitive to that same odor, despite never experiencing the conditioning themselves. The researchers also found methylation differences in sperm of parents' DNA related to the odor receptor gene. This study became one of the most influential examples of potential transgenerational epigenetic inheritance in animals. The researchers found hypomethylation of an odor receptor gene in the sperm of fathers, in the conditioned fathers, and they also found that their offspring showed increased sensitivity to the same odor and enlarged odor processing structures in the brain. Some critiques of the study was that although the sperm methylation difference, um, basically like it did not like directly demonstrate connection. Like it just didn't, it was not, it was basically a correlational study, and it didn't like demonstrate a direct mechanism. It basically just showed in the conditioned parent rats there was like a methylation difference, and that in the offspring there was a behavior difference and a difference in brain structure, but it didn't really show a transmission of epigenetic like methylation structures in both generations. Also, the study is not extensively replicated. It's replicated in a little bit like of a mixed way, and the sample size is small. So to basically act as if this is like a confirmation of epigenetic transmission in human beings related to trauma is like a stretch, even though it is a interesting study that kind of counters like kind of seemingly like a lot of preconceptions we had about um like how like transmission of trauma might work. This is a study that is also mentioned in my grandmother's hands. It is basically probably the closest study I could find that is connected to trauma being connected to like methylation pattern differences in human beings. Um, Basically, it found that in Holocaust survivors and their children, there were correlated methylation patterns in certain like areas. like in a gene that helps regulate the body's response to stress. They found correlation in the methylation patterns between parent and offspring. It was just a little odd because the correlation was like inverse. So like the parents, it was like higher levels, methylation levels, and in the offspring it was lower than in the control group, which was like non-exposed to anything connected to the trauma of the Holocaust. Um, so that is like an odd correlation, but it's still a correlation. So people are just like interested in it. Um, but again, it's correlational, so it doesn't explain like a mechanism. It's not experimental study, and it uses a relatively small sample, and um, it's just like the mechanism isn't really understood, but it's interesting because there is like some type of correlation seemingly happening between methylation patterns and a thing connected to trauma. So yeah, this is like a lot of the evidence. This is part of the like a big part of like this study, this that to me this doesn't seem like a super strong study, is a big inspiration for like the idea that trauma is transmitted epigenetically. So I do think it's interesting, but the idea that like it's just making people jump to confident conclusions is doesn't really make sense to me. Here's some more studies just about epigenetics in general, like connected to race, not necessarily to epigenetic, like genetic generational transmission. Basically, it just found that like African American women generally had higher like levels, like they found correlations between methylation levels and like questionnaires related to racial like discrimination, which would make sense because it has already been kind of like confirmed that in an individual's life, like trauma experiences correlate with methylation levels, and like racial discrimination is a stressor. It's like a type of trauma. Here's another study, and it basically comes to a similar conclusion that methylation patterns correlate with racial stressors, and it talks it kind of like brings into the dialogue the idea of testing for like epigenetic age, which is basically like a kind of system that has been developed for basically like measuring epigenetic markers as a measure of like your like technical like epigenetic age, which is just like basically like if you've been exposed to more stressors, you have more methylation markers, and you'll basically have like you'll age quicker. You'll have like a lot of the negative effects of aging sooner. Here's one more study that basically like reinforces the previous study that African American women like there's like have a correlation between like methylation levels, epigenetic aging, and racial stress. So basically, in conclusion, I found that research suggests that experiences of racial discrimination, chronic stress, and trauma are associated with differences in DNA methylation and accelerated epigenetic aging. Evidence indicates that environmental experiences can influence epigenetic processes within an individual's lifetime without changing the underlying DNA sequence. Several studies suggest that trauma-related epigenetic effects may influence subsequent generations. However, evidence for true transgenerational epigenetic inheritance in humans remains limited and debated. Overall, current research supports the idea that racial trauma can become biologically embedded through epigenetic mechanisms, while questions about inheritance across generations requires further investigation. So again, basically, it's confirmed that there's a correlation between epigenetic markers and trauma in an individual's lifetime. The idea that it is transmitted through generations is much more speculative, as I demonstrated through the limited nature of the studies that were mentioned um, earlier. Thank you and a wonderful day.